every second and fourth Thursday of the month at noon Mountain, we will be here with a new presentation. During the presentation, you may come up with questions. If you do, please use the Q&A button on your screen to send in your question. It will be addressed at the end. Now, I would like to introduce you to today's presenters. We have two today, as you can see. Ray Feller and Steve Feller. Ray Feller is Associate Dean and Director of Student Support Services at MIT. Her passion for numismatics began as a way to spend time with her father, Steve. As a child, she authored the Rachel Notes column in the International Banknote Society Journal, continuing through grad school. Ray's doctoral dissertation focused on how collecting helps people process trauma. She very much enjoys research with a special interest in World War II currency. She and Steve co-authored Silent Witnesses, Civilian Camp Money of World War II, and they've written articles, giving numerous presentations, and lead the educational program at MPC Fest. Ray also collects short snorters and notes with personal stories. Steve has been a physics professor at Coe College in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, for over 46 years. He is an active numismatist and has a research interest in civilian camp money of the Second World War. The book he co-wrote with his daughter was awarded with Book of the Year recognition by the Numismatic Literary Guild. Steve has written over 170 articles on numismatic topics, many with Ray, including World War II, the Mafeking Siege, the American Civil War, and other topics. He served as the editor of the International Banknote Society Journal for 17 years. He works with Ray on the annual MPC Fest educational program. Ray and Steve recently received 2 Newman Portal Awards to research money used in American internment camps. Ray and Steve will be presenting A Great Tale of Discovery, Money from the Women's Internment Camp on the Isle of Man. It is all yours now, Ray and Steve.
As Paula said, the two of us like to do research together. We think that these topics are really important, and we really appreciate the opportunity to be here. We're going to give, some of this is going to be about the history, and then some of it is going to be just about the process of finding out the information, and we will be excited to engage with everybody at the end if there are questions, and hopefully there will be some. So a little bit of context just to start things off. So this story of the Isle of Man is about civilian internment. And the civilian internment in this case were people in the United Kingdom who were from enemy aliens from countries that were considered enemies, like Germany and Austria. These were sometimes people who had already been in the UK for even decades. They were also sometimes people who had come recently. There's an account, for example, of somebody who came on the Kinder transport to the UK and ended up being interned on the Isle of Man, which is the place we're going to talk about. So part of what happened was, as the war is happening and evolving, people are getting nervous. And in some ways, that fear is getting stoked. So in particular, the tabloids were very active in sort of saying, how is it that we have all of these people here from these countries? How can we feel safe? And the government, in a somewhat rushed way, decided that in order to address this fear, they would bring in the people who were from countries, in particular Germany and Austria, to do a hearing to see, is this somebody who's safe to have in this country? And there was a whole process, and they rated them. And then regardless, once, as things got sort of escalated, they ended up doing large group internment, even for people who had had a hearing and had been declared to be low risk. So that's sort of the backdrop of where this all begins. And I'll let my dad talk a little bit specifically about the Isle of Man.
So the Isle of Man is in the Irish Sea between Scotland, England, and Ireland. It's a little sliver of land. It's about 30 miles at its widest and about 10 miles at its thinnest. It has a capital, Douglas. It is a country that is not in the UK, but it is a British Crown dependency. It has its own parliament. It has its own money even to this day on the pound sterling system. One Isle of Man pound is one English pound. It was a holiday spot before World War II and after World War II. An ideal spot to round up the inhabitants, send them away from their hotels, and bring in the internees. Put barbed wire around sections of Douglas and the surrounding area, and by the end of World War II, at least they had 10 internment camps. We will focus in this talk on the southern part, where you see Port St. Mary, and you'll see a couple of islands, Castletown. That's where they set up the one and only women and children's camp. Next slide, Ray. So here's an ad for the Isle of Man as a vacation spot. Notice their symbol, the Triscolus on the left, the three-legged thing. Basically, the motto is, you always land on your feet. Next slide by Ray. So zooming in on Douglas, a place I visited, by the way, in 1999 with a co-college student, mainly along the seaside, they set up internment camps in the very way I just said. So Palace, for example, is a series of small hotels that became a single internment camp. Ditto for the Metropole, which was one big hotel and several smaller ones. Onchan, on the other hand, was a block of apartments with the same system. Tell the inhabitants you're out, pay the owners, rent, and you have an internment camp. So most of these camps issued their own distinctive money. That is to say, Palace and Metropole, for example, and Onchan, each had their own unique money issues. After a while, they combined them into one single monetary system, and notes are known from that as well. Keep going, Ray. So this is a little montage from an earlier talk given to the London School of Economics. On the left is a little fiberboard, cardboard chit for a penny from the Metropole Camp. That's a fairly rare note. You can see the Sefton Internment Camp, Douglas. That was and is a hotel. It's a little bit odd, but the Sefton Hotel is a 5-star hotel today. Magnificent restaurant. I ate there, actually. Kind of odd to eat in an internment campsite, but it still exists. You see the Palace Camp. On the right, Ray's going to talk about the railroad chits / tickets. On the left bottom, that's also from the Sefton Camp. That's a Christmas card from 1940, using the money as the backdrop. Okay, Ray.
All right, so to talk a little bit about the location here. So as my dad mentioned, this was Rushen was for, and Port Erin were for the women and children. It was very different from, in terms of a setup. They didn't have the same kinds of hotels that you could then put the barbed wire around and just turn into a camp. It was more an area. And so there's actually, interestingly, there's sort of set up a barbed wire sort of line across the island, and even the citizens of the Isle of Man who are on the other side were living then in effect in the camp, which was more sort of an area. So they had people who owned boarding houses. They had people who were asked to house these women and children in their boarding houses, in their houses. And again, it's fairly haphazard. So including, we have examples of women being placed in the same room in a shared bed, and one of them is a Jewish woman who has fled from Germany, and the other is a Nazi sympathizer, and they're in the same room, in the same space. They were also asked to sort of manage food and for everybody there. So you've got people aboard, someone running a boarding house maybe who might be used to, preparing room and board, but you've also got people in their homes and sort of trying to figure out how you feed everybody in a way that's somewhat consistent, even though they're sort of spread out into all these little spaces. So interestingly, as my dad mentioned, one of the things that we have been learning about is the ways that people were able to still stay connected. So here, this is a train ticket. It's going from Ramsey, so up where the men were, to Port Erin and back, you can see. And this is an officer, an escort, or sorry, 4 escorts and 28 internees. And this is their ticket to be able to travel down so that people could actually visit with their families. Over the course of the war, they eventually were able to reunite some of the families, but at this time, here's an example of a ticket where you can see the story sort of unfolding as people are trying to navigate this complicated time.
So I'll talk about this one now. Mail was allowed in and out of the camps. By the way, we're building to the money system, which was absolutely incredible in this woman's camp. So you see it says Rushen Internment Camp, Women's Internment Camp, 13 September 1940. They had the franking privilege, free postage. And this is going to Professor Otto E. Deutsch, a noted scholar, a music scholar. It's going to him from his daughter. And it's in English. And if you look hard, well, actually, it starts on the other side and it finishes here. It's from Greta Deutsch, her hotel, Port Erin. Dearest, go back.
Do you want the...
Go back. Dearest father, Vati, I have just had a note from the camp bank that your 5 shillings have arrived, and that I was able to tell you they have arrived. Your letter I got yesterday, and on about her life, and the fact that she's sad to miss a concert that's going to take place in her father's camp, the Metropole Camp. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm working on it. Okay.
Just a close-up again of the Women's Internment Camp's stamp. So just about this time, money begins to show up as the economy is actually developed there. This, by the way, is a receipt for money coming from outside of the Russian camp that's being deposited. In this case, money came from the Refugee Children's Movement, Bloomsbury Street, London. And it's acknowledgement that the money is being placed in the camp bank. Go ahead. Here's another one, similar, Russian camp. This is for with regards to Lizzie Grunwald. The sum of, now what was fascinating to me there was that's $4. So perhaps it's money coming from the US has been placed to your credit in the camp bank. Go ahead, Ray. October 19th, 1940, by the way, around the same time.
So interestingly, so we've got all of these people. I mean, this is sort of part of the story of the internment camps, here in the United States and Australia and lots of places where you've got people who are sort of together and they're restless because they aren't allowed to participate in their regular lives. They're given a lot of time and they're trying to figure out what to do with it. So interestingly, the women start to get creative. They start to, this is actually a class, they start to host classes. They start to, bring together performances. And we had heard about this idea in the Russian camp where rather than having a formal money like the men's camps had, that they had to create something of their own, of sort of a barter system. And this is actually from the time, an illustration from the newspaper of things that were being made in Port Erin by the women in the women's camp. So the description we had heard was that there were little money coupons that were made on the back of cornflake boxes. And of course, we were very intrigued by this, but had never seen one. And in fact, had asked in various places, including the Manx Museum, has anyone, and people know this story, it's recorded, it's mentioned, but what we were wanting was, can we actually see one of these things and understand what it was? So we start to go on our sort of discovery adventure. And we were able to track down this woman, Ruth Borchard, who was, it turns out, the main originator of the idea of having this system to help the women feel engaged and have better morale and have things they could do. Now, interestingly, so she actually was an economist. She got her doctorate in Hamburg, and she wrote her dissertation actually there about work systems in America. She actually, while studying in Hamburg, spent a year at University of Wisconsin-Madison doing research. And this, she was already thinking a bit about the ways that people work and get compensated for their work. And we actually were able to track down her daughter, who is living in the UK and who was willing to speak with us about her recollections of her mother and was able to point us to some very interesting sources. This we don't have a great copy of, but this is actually at the time she was published in the American Journal of Economics and Sociology, where she is talking actually about the system that she set up in the camp. So here I'll just read a couple of things in here. She's describing how they've got all these women, she says, fairly comfortably settled in the boarding houses of Port Erin for an indefinite period with nothing to do. And she's talking about how the men had been able to get paid for work, but they were sort of begging for it. And so finally they ask for permission, and that the head of the camp agrees. So it says here, the idea of the service exchange was simple enough on the surface. Instead of everybody doing everything for herself, let each do what she knows how to do best and exchange it for what the others know how to do better. That is, we propose to raise the standard of living by introducing into camp life the principle of the division of labor. As a means of exchange, we proposed work receipts, service coupons. And then she goes on later to say, all we offered was payment in tokens, of which one of us was busy producing some thousands by cutting up cornflake boxes into small squares and putting a rubber stamp to them, our mint. This one may call politely a currency backed by the productivity of the community, but we preferred not to have pointed out to us striking resemblances of our method to that employed by certain countries today. And then we waited. Would a single soul turn up? To our surprise, during the first 2 weeks, 1,200 women volunteered. Boredom and dire need caused them to. You can also see here from the time, this is a sort of a cartoon talking about life there. It's a little hard to see, but here they've got Gigi, our best worker. She's doing laundry. And this, which I tried to blow up as well as I could, is Margot says, I'll do all work for a penny. And here are some examples of some of the things that the women made. And then there's a lot in there about making sure they had the supplies they needed. I mean, they really are setting up an economy. So they've got people who want to work. They actually have more people wanting to work than they have the materials for them to work. So they're sort of trying to figure out how they divide and give everybody opportunity. Here are some toys that were made. Some more interesting details. So Christmas brought land in sight, and badly needed it was. All our bric-a-brac sold like hotcakes. We earned pounds and shoveled in tokens. In the street, people waylaid others who went into our shop to buy in cash. Couldn't they sell them their tokens? Prices in the black market varied between 1.5 and 3 pounds for one token.
Pence.
Pence. Sorry, pence. I know yes, sorry. And then she's talking about how they're getting all of the materials that they need. They're also, you can see, they're not just making things, they're also doing things like cleaning. They're setting up jobs. They're using the tokens in the lending library and shows and concerts. And people, so interestingly, and we'll show you some example of this later, as women are also being released from the camp, they actually continue participating in this system, and they are actually taking things that are being made in the camp and they are selling them back in the UK and then sending the money back again. So at its height, the turnover of the exchange was nearly 1,500 pounds, 480 pounds in cash, and the rest in tokens. So they're providing services, goods, about 8,000 tokens in circulation, which came back 10 times, except for 260 tokens, which have not been presented. All tokens have been duly redeemed. And here is actually the ledger book from Cambridge. So this is from a woman who has gone now to Cambridge, and she's sending money back and getting supplies or getting the items that they made and sort of expanding the economy in that way. So just to go back for a moment, at its height, 8,000 tokens in circulation, except for 260, which had not been presented. And of course, our question was, can we see one? And I'll let Dad take over from there.
So there were 260 tokens unredeemed. And as Ray said, that led to the hunt. So there have been a few books on Isle of Man money. Pam West, for example, is co-author of the standard text on Isle of Man paper money. And I asked her, she knew of the scheme, of the system, and never seen a note. I went to the Isle of Man in 1999 with a co-college student, asked the numismatic dealers there and leading collectors. They all knew of the scheme. None had ever seen a token. So last year was about 80 years since the scheme took place. And unlike the men's camps, in which examples from every camp are known today in the collectors' marketplace, and they're fairly scarce even for the men's camps. Typical prices might be, I don't know, $300 to $5,000 for a note. Since they're great items. Not one woman's camp little cardboard token had ever been, as far as we could tell, sold, seen, auctioned, or whatever. I asked the museum. So it is a country, as I said, and it has its own national museum called the Manx Museum, MANX, just like the cat. And I saw their numismatic holdings, spent several days there, not a single cardboard token. They have a great collection, actually, probably the best collection in the world of Isle of Man internment camp money, but not one from the women's camp. They knew of our interest. Ray and I prepared a talk for as I mentioned, the London School of Economics, which included experts on the Isle of Man camps. The Manx Museum contacted us last year. A daughter of one of the survivors, who had since passed away, was donating to the museum her mother's holdings. And there in the holdings were two little itty-bitty tokens. For the first time, we now know exactly what they look like. And perhaps Ray's going to hit the button. So there we have the Rushen Internment Camp Women Service Token. Two of them. Even a double strike on the left. Or it looks like a double strike of some sort. They're modest. I've not seen them live, so to speak. Although I'd love to go back to the Isle of Man. I'd love to go to Rushen. When I went, I was only there for a few days, so I made the mistake of not going to the site of the women's camp, which, by the way, was also different from the men's camps, in that although they had barbed wire, it was across the entire southern region. So the woman lived with the people actually in that area and children. So they had access to miles of land, several square miles at the southern end of the island. They could go to the beach. They could go to the movie theater down there. Today, there is a museum at Rushen or at Port Erin, and they held recently an exhibition on the internment camps there, which included a book which describes the service scheme in great detail. So Ruth's ideas have come to be known today, probably in more detail than any other camp money from the Second World War. Although we're trying to change that with recent research on the Japanese and German and Italian American camps in this country. If you can believe it, 2, 3, and 4 days ago, we were in the National Archives doing research on that topic. All right, Ray. Next slide. So the end of the war comes, and the camps begin to get emptied. For the men's camps, they would serve another purpose. They were converted into POW camps. But for the women's camp, it was just emptied, and that was the end of it. So this is the station at Port Erin, in which the women are going back on the trains, coming from the camps, well, from the entire region, which was the camp, and leaving. The Isle of Man has this extensive train system, even though it's 30 miles by 10 miles. I suppose many of you have heard of Thomas the Tank Engine. That was modeled by the Isle of Man train system. So trains they had. I should mention that those coupons for the trains that were used by men and women allowed the people to get together, allowed husbands and wives to see each other, fathers to see children. A system, if you would, extended over the entire island. So this is the terminus at the southern end of the island of the trains. Okay, if Ray can continue. So a little advertisement, I guess, at this point. We wrote a book on civilian camp money of World War II, published by B&R Press. And in it, we go into great detail about the Isle of Man money. Ray is pointing to a note on the bottom, which is from the Peveril Camp on the west coast of the Isle of Man. Ray is pointing out to the Home Office notes, which came after the individual camp notes. Above that is an Onchan note right there. But you'll notice when the book was written, no Rushen camp note. It wasn't known yet. That'll be in the next edition, I hope. I want to tell you one little story maybe about the nature of research, why I think it would still be useful to go to Rushen these many years later. I went to the Metropole Camp, which I showed you money from on that earlier slide, with my co-college student. And it smelled of history. It had one dangling light bulb, and about an 80-year-old man just came down the stairs. And he asked us what we wanted. We had gotten the map from the Manx Museum of exactly where the campsites were. So we walked into this one, into the Metropole Hotel, and we asked him, were you aware that this was an internment camp in World War II? He said yes, which didn't surprise me in the least. So, of course, I asked what might be a simple question. Is there anything left from that period? Well, he goes, about 2 years earlier, they were clearing out the floorboards on the second floor and renovating it. And they had found hundreds of documents from the camp. Would I be interested in those? And out came a treasure trove of original documents from the camp, both as a civilian internment camp and as a POW camp, including original German Red Cross wrappers, German newspapers for prisoners of war, much good stuff. Most of it we donated to the Manx Museum because they are the preservers of Manx history. Accidentally, perhaps, a few of the items ended up in the fellow collection. I'm ashamed to admit, but I still have those items. And I repeated this process, and it was through that process that I learned where the most prominent collector was. He has since passed away, who spent the whole afternoon with us, showing us the original documents for the printing and minting, they had coins too, of camp money. He had hundreds of documents, some of which are reproduced in the book. I have more stories, but in terms of stories of the camps, I think we gave you a pretty good taste of it, especially of the Rushen camp, and it's a very organized money system. Next slide. So we do acknowledge the following. Catherine Horgot, she is the daughter of Ruth Borchard. She herself was interned in Rushen, but only as a young child. The Manx Museum, for information on the women's camp, for showing us those wonderful tokens, and for information on the men's camps as well. The Newman Numismatic Foundation for lots of support of what I'll call the Camp Money Project. The ANA for hosting this show. Eric Hammerstein, he is the student who went with me in 1999 for the research trip to the Isle of Man. And I teach at Cole College, and Ray is in her office at MIT as the Dean of Student Support Services. And I think with that, that might be it. Is that it, Ray?
Well, hopefully there'll be some questions and we can certainly go into more detail on anything people are curious about.
Okay. So we're ready for questions. Go ahead, Paula. Sorry.
Okay, so if you wouldn't mind stop sharing, and then I will pull up the Q&A. Somebody is letting us know that if there are any Manx men or women watching, the North American Manx Association is an interesting and fun association to join. We do have in-person meetings and online meetings. If anyone would like any information, Zach says, let him know.
Now, by we, does that mean he's a member?
It appears so, yes.
Well, I'll simply advertise now. If he wants this talk to his group, let us know. I don't know, maybe Ray can put her email address in the chat.
I don't think there's a chat.
No, but if you want to, if anybody does want to reach out to you guys, you can email education@money.org and I can forward to you.
Okay.
That way you're not putting your stuff out, because this is recorded, so it'll be out there forever if you.
Okay.
But education@money.org, and that I will see that and I can forward it on to them if anybody needs. Let's see. Was the mail between camps sent via the postal service of IOM or sent by carrier from the camps?
I will briefly discuss it. It turns out that the philatelic side, the study of the postal, or the stamps and the mail, is more developed than the numismatic side. And so we know what happened. And if you can believe it, that postcard from the daughter Greta, sorry, to her father Otto, was sent via London. So it went down to London and back up, ending up maybe 3 miles away from where it started. So all mail was sent to London. The mail had to be censored also. And there were postcards and letters.
Okay. Let's see. What nationalities were interred on the Isle of Man?
So Yeah, so this could, and hi, Tom. So this could be anybody considered an enemy alien. So that could be Italian, German, Austrian. Um, I think that there actually were some Japanese people too, but a very small number. And like we mentioned at the beginning, it's a big divide because there are, especially at the beginning where it was very disorganized, eventually they tried to kind of group people more um, by sort of category, but you've got actually a lot of Jewish people and a lot of people who identify with the Nazi Party who at first are all together because nationality-wise they're coming from these enemy alien or they're enemy aliens coming from enemy nations, regardless of why they left in the first place. Um, and and like I said, the process of having these hearings was sort of abandoned in the middle. So even people who had had a hearing and had been determined to be not a risk were still interned next to people who had had a hearing and were determined to be a risk. So as much as possible, they ultimately tried to kind of divide people out so that they're with like-minded folk. And, like I mentioned with the women's camp, across a lot of these camps, there's this restlessness that leads to sort of productivity. So lots of people making things, learning things, teaching things, classes, seminars, and there were meetings, including meetings of you've got Jewish people having services for holidays and for Shabbat and so on, and you've got Nazi groups getting together and talking about politics. So you've got the whole range. And obviously people frustrated to be in these camps for different reasons. And also to mention, as they're going to the camps, they already have an idea, many of them, of what a camp is. So you've also got people who were very, very scared because they had possibly already been imprisoned in one of the early camps in Europe, or England is in Europe, but in Sachsenhausen, or and now they're being told they're going to a camp, and a lot of it looks very similar. They're getting on trains and they're asked to pack a bag and they're given very little time. And so there were people who were very scared, both there and in the US. There were people who were very scared about what was going to happen to them. So it's a very interesting blend of people on the Isle of Man.
I'll also mention that some nationalities were grouped together in the Isle of Man camps. Um, I was fortunate on the famous eBay once to see an Italian fellow. He must have passed away. His wallet was being sold, and I saw enough of the wallet to see that there were 4 internment camp notes from the Isle of Man in it, and it was clear that they were real. So luckily, my colleagues in the numismatic field didn't see it because those are very rare notes, and now they are in the fellow collection.
Another question. Were Russians interned initially and then released after the Soviets joined the Allies?
Well, the Russians were never enemies. They had an agreement with on Nazi Germany, the so-called Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, but they were not at war with Britain at any time. So to my knowledge, at least, they were not interned. Then they became allies after the Germans attacked um, the Soviet Union.
Could the internees get out of the camps by joining the British military, as happened with Japanese in the US?
Answer is yes, and ultimately many did join. And they got out over months or years. By the time the war ended, these were mainly POW camps. So they were able to get out as their cases were adjudicated, as somewhat obvious cases where people have been loyal in Britain for decades were interned. They were not a threat, really. But it took a while for that to happen. So, for example, Getter wrote a book called The Red Thread, which I have. And she describes how her friends got out before she did. It was arbitrary. And she was sad, of course, that she still had to stay in the camp. That's the daughter of Otto. So
It also might be worth mentioning that the Isle of Man well, first of all, the Isle of Man was also used as camps in World War One. So there was some precedent already. But also just to say that's not the only place that the British were sending people. And one of the most interesting notes that there is, I think, comes from Camp Hay in Australia, but they also sent people in this same disorganized sort of way, including Jewish refugees, all the way to Australia to be interned. And people there, the restlessness and frustration was very high, including that if you're in the Isle of Man and you get released, it's a lot easier to get back to your life. A lot of people ended out, if you're in Australia or Canada, I mean, it's a much harder thing to be able to go through these processes. And many wanted desperately to join the British military and were not able to do that, at least in a timely way, regardless.
let me mention that the same process of interning enemy aliens or similar to that used in Britain occurred in this country, as I alluded to before. So I mentioned Ray and I were scanning documents, many documents over the last week. So there were enemy alien camps in Crystal City, Texas. Ellis Island became an internment camp for enemy aliens in World War II. These are separate, by the way, then from the Japanese American camps. All of these camps had money, by the way, even in the U.S. And we're trying to uncover that story. So there were 10 relocation camps in the United States for Japanese Americans. There were assembly centers in California, Oregon, and Washington where they were first put Japanese American citizens. By the way, a Supreme Court case in World War II deemed it legal, but eventually the United States government apologized, not to all groups, but to Japanese Americans who were interned, and issued each one who had survived until the 1980s a government check for $20,000. But the German Americans are still clamoring, still to this day, for their $20,000. But Congress has not enacted it. There were POW camps in the United States that issued money. That's a collector's field. There were about 500 such camps. So this is a big part of World War II, the camp story. I'm sure when I say 10,000 camps, that's a low number. It's an enormous number. And dare I say that to this very day, there are camps. And someday somebody will study the money of those camps, including today in the United States. Next question.
Was there any discussion about how the local population thought about the camp or the people inside the camp?
The answer to that is yes. The contemporary newspapers described the camps in detail. And for the most part, the internees were well received on the whole. It brought jobs and business. It raised the standard of living on the Isle of Man. There was one case of, there were several attempts at escape, but one that was successful. People didn't get off the Isle of Man, but that caused some resentment. You can read about that in the newspaper. They snuck their way out of the camp. That was the Peveril Camp in the north. That's a good question, though, on the local relationships, because in the women's camp, they were quite close to the Isle of Man people, since those people still lived in their homes.
Yeah, I mean, economically, it's a really important piece because normally this would be a tourist place. And so in some ways, this was a saving grace for people because then they got paid to house people. It sort of, they got like I think a guinea per person or something like that per week. I don't remember, but they got compensated, and that was helpful because otherwise these would have been empty rooms because during the war you don't have the same kind of tourist season.
A guinea, by the way, is an odd denomination. It's the right number, but it's just over a pound. A pound is 20 shillings, and a guinea is 21 shillings. Very odd denomination.
I will say that I did Google the North American Manx website, and it is just namanx.org for anybody interested.
Okay.
So I don't have any more questions at this moment, but I'm going to do the wrap up and then we'll see if any more pop in, if that's okay.
Well, so far the questions have been quite good. I thank the questioners.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's an interesting topic for sure. I do want to thank everybody, Ray and Steve, for a great presentation. Our NumismaTalks are being recorded and will be available to our members on our website at money.org, and then click on the education tab and you'll be able to find everything under the e-learning academy. Please be sure to check for future programs at that same location, money.org, and the education tab. So I just want to thank you guys. That was so interesting. And the questions, I think, were added so much to the presentation as well. Let's see. Okay. Says Zach will reach out to us so that you can
Yes,
be in
good.
contact.
Good.
Perfect. All right. Okay. Well, I think that's it. Thank you again. And are you guys going to be at the World's Fair of Money?
We will.
be.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll be at Money Talk, so you can find me there.
Okay. And we'll be looking for more examples of camp money.
There you go. All right. Thank you guys so much.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Have a great day.